Yeah, just having a snack. I mean, can't really talk about digestion without eating something, right? So here, what I want you to do is this. I want you to stop whatever it is that you're doing, which is watching this video, and I want you to go get something to eat. Okay, and I'll be here when you get back. And by that I mean you press pause, go get something to eat, and then I'll be here when you get back. Okay, you good? All right. Now, you still have that thing that you got to eat, right? Because I didn't mean go eat something and then come back. I meant go get something to eat and then come back so that you could like put it in your mouth now. So if you ate something and then came back but didn't bring something back to eat, then I want you to go do that. So I'll be here while you do that, but really what I mean is press pause and then get something to eat and then bring it back. But don't eat it yet. All right, so when we talk about the digestive system, we have to understand that there are 4 major processes that go on. The first one is ingestion, and really, there's only one way that you're going to get things into your mouth. Unless, of course, you're under really dire circumstances or you lost a bet, I suppose you could ingest through your nose, but that's not ideal, and you really don't want to find yourself in that situation. But primarily, ingestion only occurs in one place, and that is through your mouth. Then as we go through there, we get into processes of digestion, which occurs in multiple locations, and we're going to talk about those. We get into absorption, which also occurs in a couple of different places, or several different places in the body, and we'll talk about those. And then there's egestion, and your digestive system is pretty much just a one-way pathway, and there's only one place that you egest waste. And we will talk about that, but I'm not going to demonstrate it for obvious reasons. But the first thing I want you to do is take that food item that you've got and put it in between your lips. And what I want you to think about while you're going through this process is, as much as possible, think about the piece of food that you have in your mouth and what's going on as we describe the different processes and different components and different structures within the digestive system itself. So let's get started with the mouth. You see, your lips are the first thing that this food encounters. And as you have it between your lips, try your best to move that food into your mouth without touching it with your hands. That is right, just move it directly in with your lips, just like a camel. So now that you have that food in your mouth, you can start to chew. But the main function of the lips is to get food or help food into the mouth and keep it in there. Now that your lips have done their work, it's the tongue's time to shine. So as you sit there and chew that food, I want you to think about the action of the tongue. Not only is the tongue responsible for chemically analyzing or tasting the food, but it's also involved in positioning it in the mouth appropriately as we go through this first part of digestion. So the tongue is going to position it against the roof of the mouth. There's a rigid structure up there that we call the hard palate. You'll notice that there's little bumps or ridges if you run your tongue over it, and it's there to help masticate and mash the food and break it down further. The tongue is going to position the food against the different types of teeth to again help it further break down, and it's going to mix it with the saliva produced by the salivary glands before positioning the food at the back of the throat before swallowing. I just want to stop for a second and talk about structure and function. When we think about the structure of something, it's how it's made up, what it looks like, the way that it's formed. And the function is, of course, what it does. And so one of the first things that we come across in internal systems, or at least in the digestive system, when we think about how the structure relates to the function of that thing, it is the teeth. And our teeth are structured in such a way that it supports our omnivorous diet, that we can eat both meat and plant matter. But if you take a look at, say, one of your pets, a cat or a dog, and you look at their teeth, you're going to notice that their structure is a little bit different. They have far pointier teeth than you or I. They have similar canine teeth to us, although those are much larger, because their diet is primarily, or at least meant to be, primarily meat. That is, they are carnivores. And you might say, yeah, but I feed my dog carrots all the time. Yeah, that's fine. But in the wild, their diet would primarily be one of meat. And so their teeth are going to be structured a little bit differently because the primary function for your dog or your cat is that of a carnivore, to eat meat. Whereas our teeth are structured a little bit differently because we are omnivores, eating both meat and plant matter. And as omnivores and having different diets, that is, we have different types of food that we eat, we have different structures to the teeth because they each have different functions. I've already talked about the canines, a little bit about the incisors, and that they're there much like carnivores have for tearing and shearing meat. But we also have teeth, the premolars and molars, which are there for mashing. They're a little bit flatter, they have a greater surface area, and they would be similar to the types of teeth that we would find in herbivores, that is, those organisms that primarily consume plant matter. And speaking of teeth, they're involved in one of the first types of digestion that occurs in the body, and that is mechanical or physical digestion. That is, they're involved in the actual physical breakdown of food matter. Now, the other type of digestion that occurs in the mouth is chemical digestion. And chemical digestion involves the action of something called enzymes. Now, the enzymes that we find in the mouth specifically are there to break down starches and in some cases break down fats or lipids. So now that we have this bolus of food at the back of our throat, we need to be aware that swallowing can sometimes be a dangerous endeavor, and as a result, we have some protective measures in the body that help protect us during the act of swallowing. The first thing, as we've already mentioned, is that we have that soft palate that moves back as we swallow, as the tongue positions the food at the back of the throat, and we have the little dangly thing that if you open up your mouth and look in the mirror, actually covers the opening to the nasal cavity, which prevents food from going up into the nose. We call this little dangly thing the uvula. And so the soft palate and the uvula collectively prevent food from going up into the nasal cavity during the act of swallowing. In addition, as the food is being passed down to the throat, we do not want the food going into our respiratory system or entering our windpipe or trachea. And as a result, towards the base of the tongue, at the rear of the mouth, we have a structure called the epiglottis. So the epiglottis closes over the opening into our trachea as we go through the act of swallowing, so as to prevent any food from entering somewhere where we don't want it to be, and we certainly don't want it to be entering our respiratory system. Now, once you've chewed food enough, you consciously, for the most part, make the decision to swallow it. That is, swallowing, again, for the most part, is voluntary. It's a conscious decision. But once you have done so, the movement down the esophagus is an involuntary movement. You are not actively thinking about moving that food from your mouth into your stomach down the length of your esophagus. Rather, there is an involuntary smooth muscle contraction that we call peristalsis that acts to move that bolus of food from the mouth into the stomach. Okay, so if you're like me, you've come across this scenario more than you can count. You've somehow got your favorite ball caught in a tube sock. Now, how are we going to get it out? Well, we could wait and hope that the sock's going to degenerate or degrade over time, or that there's a magic fairy that's going to come and free the ball of the constraints of this tube sock. But the other way is we could try and remove it ourselves. And the way that we generally would try and remove something of this nature from a tube sock is to draw our fingers down along the length of the tube sock. Now, similar to peristalsis, this mimics the action of what goes on to move food down from your mouth into the stomach. There are contractions of muscle behind the bolus of food until such time that it gets to its ultimate destination, which is the stomach. So the stomach, as you can see, is an expandable sac that's composed of various layers of musculature. Those muscles are going to flex and move in different directions, and it acts to churn the food that is in the stomach. You're going to notice too that it's J-shaped. And the reason that we have a J-shaped sac is because we want the food and all of the liquids that are in there to rest at the bottom and not put too much stress on the sphincters or the valves that control food into and out of the stomach, more specifically, out of the stomach. Now, the stomach, much like the mouth, is a site of physical or mechanical digestion. We have the aforementioned layers of muscle moving and contracting to break down the food. And again, much like the mouth, it not only has physical digestion, but also is a location of chemical digestion. There are secretory cells located within the walls of the stomach itself. And one of the things that they release is gastric juice. And this gastric juice provides an ideal environment for some of the enzymes to start breaking down the various components that are being digested in the stomach. So while this acidic environment is ideal for the proteases or enzymes that break down proteins in your stomach, it's not ideal for the tissue that lines the inside of the stomach. So one of the ways that your stomach protects itself is to line itself with mucus. And this mucus lining acts to serve as a protective layer between the walls of the stomach and the acidic environment of the stomach. So now that the stomach has done its job and has started the process of breaking down proteins as well as mixing up the food even further, we now collectively call all of this material chyme. And the chyme now moves through the pyloric sphincter into the intestines. Now if you have one of these or something like it, we call these drawstring bags. And they work kind of the same way that the sphincters work in your body, specifically those that are in the stomach. In that when we draw them together, we can see how those sphincters start to close, and then when the muscles relax, they will allow food into and out of the stomach. So in the case of our cardiac sphincter, the one that the food is going to first encounter when it goes from the esophagus into the stomach, that is going to open to allow food in and then draw to prevent food from getting back out. Conditions where that food gets back out, especially when it's mixed with stomach acid, relate to some of the ulcers that people do tend to get. And then if we look at the other end, that pyloric sphincter, it's the same sort of thing where that drawstring closes and prevents food, the chyme, from getting into the intestine too quickly. And once it can empty into the intestine, the sphincter is going to open and allow the food to flow in there. So the sphincters that you have in your stomach and other places in your body are there to allow food into and out of, much like this drawstring bag, by opening and closing to allow things in and out. And now that the acidic chyme has traveled through the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine, we have to remember that it is still acidic. It has a low pH and can potentially damage some of the tissues that it's going to come in contact with along the length of the small intestine. So one of the functions of the pancreatic juice that it mixes with is to neutralize that acidic chyme as it comes from the stomach. Specifically, it heads into the duodenum or duodenum of the small intestine, one of the three major components or parts of the small intestine itself. In the duodenum, this is where most of the chemical digestion occurs in the small intestine. Most of the enzymes and their action are going to be occurring here, and most of those enzymes are released in the pancreatic juice. And as we will talk about in a little more detail later on, one of the functions of the liver is to release bile, which is going to act to break down the fats or lipids into smaller components, which can then be more actively worked on by the lipases or lipid digesting enzymes. Now, as we move from the duodenum, where most of the chemical digestion in the small intestine occurs, we now find ourselves in the last two components, or the other two components of the small intestine, the jejunum and the ileum. And the major function of these two components of the small intestine is absorption. Yes, this is where most of the absorption occurs in the digestive system. So you can kind of think about your intestines like this rug. It's covered in these tiny fibers that we call villi, and they in turn are covered by even smaller fibers that we call microvilli. And then it's all highly folded over top of itself to increase the surface area to maximize the absorption of all of those macromolecules and the molecules that they've been broken down to. So if you think about it, the structure of your intestine, the increase in amount of that surface area, which can be as large as a tennis court if it were to be spread out, relates directly to its function, which is to absorb those molecules that have been digested by the rest of your digestive system. So these villi and microvilli that are maximizing the surface area of your small intestines are also highly vascularized and contain lacteals, so that anything that's absorbed can be transported right away into the circulatory system or into the lymphatic system. So believe it or not, after all of this digestion and absorption, there is still some material left. And that material moves through the ileocecal valve, from the ileum into the cecum of the large intestine. So our large intestine, or colon as it's sometimes called, is not only tasked with condensing the waste through the reabsorption of water, but also obtaining any remaining minerals or vitamins that were not yet captured through other portions of the digestive system. There are, as there are in other places, muscular contractions that are going to move food along, but it is moved along very slowly. Up the ascending colon, across the transverse colon, and down the descending colon, until it passes into the rectum, where it is stored. The rectum, yes, is an expandable pouch, and yes, thankfully at this point, even though much of this process has been involuntary, the act of egestion, or expulsion of waste, is voluntary. So how long does this whole process take? Well, it only takes a few seconds for the food to get from the mouth, once you've swallowed, to the stomach through peristalsis. It's only maybe 6 to 8 hours, potentially a little bit longer in the stomach and in the small intestines. Where the slowdown really occurs, literally and figuratively, is in the large intestines, or the colon, where it spends a lot of time condensing the waste and extracting and reabsorbing water and minerals and nutrients, and that can take 16 to 24 hours. All told, this whole process, depending on your diet and how well you are, could take 24 to 72 hours. But there are some things that we require in order to make this process go as fast as it does. And we'll talk about that in the next video. Thanks for watching.